Hello there ladies and gentlemen, TX141 here, also known as Paul, bringing you another Ace in a Day gameplay for the arcade mode of War Thunder. In today's episode, I shall be reviewing the I-16 Type 5. Having already provided a historical overview for the Politkopov I-16, which you may see using a link in the top right corner of your screen, as displayed now, let us delve into the history behind the Type 5 variant. Following on from the service trials of the Type 1 as of 22nd of March 1934, it was soon found that the I-16 Type 1 was lacking in terms of its overall power plant and therefore the power behind the frame. Two additional variants were tasked in improving upon this situation, the Type 4 and the Type 5. The Type 5 was to find its power plant operated in the form of a copy of the Wright Cyclone engine on a license-built basis. The Type 5 was set the target as of 1935 of reaching a top speed of 470 km an hour, whilst incorporating a number of the improvements made to the Type 4, which included but were not limited to armour plating for the pilot and improvements to the landing gear in terms of its doors so that the pilot would be fully enclosed within the aircraft. As a result, during test flights as of 1935, the Wright Cyclone engine copy, known as the Shvestov M25A radial engine providing 730 horsepower in the Type 5, allowed the prototype to reach a top speed of approximately 454 km an hour. Whilst this was disparate with the 470 km an hour target, this top speed was still valued quite highly, and in addition to the improvements made with the Type 5, not only those from the Type 4 per se, but also the addition of a stronger airframe structure, an oxygen system for the pilot, and a developed hand crank system for the undercarriage, the Type 5 was soon approved into combat service, with production types rolling off and into battle by 1936, with the origin of the Spanish Civil War. The Type 5 was to see service all the way through to the end of the Spanish Civil War, and that was its main theatre of operation. Whilst the plane was nowhere near as manoeuvrable, by comparison with its biplane opponents, most notably the Heinkel 51 and the CR-42, or 32 really, the I-16's overall power plant and light frame, being the lightest of any production fighter aircraft at the time of its introduction, weighing in at 1,460 kilograms, meant this plane could make its match in any of its opponents it faced, until the arrival of the Messerschmitt 109 early variants, the A's and B's, by the end of the Spanish Civil War. Additionally, whilst the plane was successful on the whole, there were a number of problems associated with its armament, or really the overall power behind the armament. The pair of 7.62mm Shikass machine guns, one in each wing, outside of the radius arc of the propeller, meant this plane had an underwhelming firepower. Whilst the fire rate of these machine guns was 1,800 rounds per minute, a significant boost on the four PV-1 machine guns of the Type 4 firing only 750 rounds per minute. This idea of improving armament through a high fire rate did not prove to be successful in reality, and it was only with the Type 10 variant as of 1937, which mounted an additional pair of 7.62mm Shikass machine guns above the engine, that the firepower problem was to be rectified for the time being. Nonetheless, the Type 5 sees its place in history as the second mainstream production variant of the I-16, following on from the Type 4, and one of the more enjoyed variants. With that being said, how exactly does the Type 5 handle in War Thunder? Well, this was an incredibly highly requested review, and I can see exactly why as I review this overall gameplay that we have here today. This plane has its frustrating moments, yet it is one of the more enjoyable aircraft I've flown for a very long time. At its battle rating of 1.7, you're going to find that this plane has a lot of traits to go with it, and a couple of vices which may hinder you in the long-term game. This ground strike game on the map Caucasus focuses on the higher battle rating opposition that you may face for your battle rating of 1.7. We are not going to be analysing the shorter period low battle rating games that you may have on the ground strike map Stalingrad or any of the other variants. Those usually dissolve into furball matches and As a result, I'd like to prove this plane in terms of its overall higher battle rate in opponents. We can see here we are chasing after an enemy Blenheim, who at roughly 4,600 metres altitude by comparison with our own 4,500 metres and increasing, is able to gradually gain some speed, but not enough to put the distance on us. Up at 4,600 metres altitude, we are really having to make ourselves work hard in order to catch our opponent. And this is one of the key frustrations that you may find in the I-16 Type 5. The climb rate of this aircraft is great. It is not the best by any margin. That goes to the Ki-43 or, say, some of the biplane aircraft such as the Ki-10. But the climb rate is more than sufficient in allowing you to get up to a higher altitude position to harass the enemy bombers, as we saw with our initial pass on this Blenheim and that SBD-3 Dauntless. The second problem, of course, is the armament. The two 7.62mm machine guns really do mean you are going to have to put a lot of ammunition into your opponent in order to put them down. And the fact they are wing based means that you have to rely on convergence more so than if they were nose mounted, especially by comparison with a good portion of the planes you will face at your battle rating. Most of the biplanes have the armament in the nose, and so this is a major deciding factor in how this plane plays out. We can see here with the Blenheim at roughly 0.6 kilometers, despite the fact that I am using a gun convergence of 300 meters, we are still getting shots into target, and I managed to kill off one of the rear gunners. And as we break away from the enemy Blenheim, and I point out to the rest of my team that one of them could go for the Blenheim that I've been harassing for a good portion of the game, let us outline our setup. We're using the stealth belt for the 7.62mm machine gun. And the reason we do this is not because this is the best belt per se, although usually stealth belts are associated as being the most lethal. I prefer the stealth belts for this plane simply because they have a majority of armour piercing incendiary components and additionally one adjustment incendiary component. This means that if any of the rounds burst through onto a fuel tank, you've got a very good chance of setting your opponents on fire. Yet this is much like the tracer belt that is filled with armour piercing incendiary tracer. But at the same time, the stealth belt without its tracers means that I'm able to take most of my opponents by surprise, and with very limited firepower, that is crucial in this aircraft. You want to be able to get in close behind and start firing at a position which your opponent is in no way able to avoid you from. Additionally, if you happen to miss in your opening burst, you are less likely to receive a reaction from your opponent that you are pursuing. If I was using the tracer belt, the fact that you have that massive white stream of lead hot tracer going past them means that your opponent is likely to react in a very short space of time. The gun convergence we are using is the 300 meter one, because most of my engagements in the I-16 Type 5 will always end up at a range of 300 meters or 0.3 kilometers, especially when I go into turn fights and more of the furball style frenzies that you will usually see in this plane. Although be aware, this also means that the large spread on the machine guns at long range can be quite useful in hitting bombers at long distance, as highlighted against that Blenheim as we pursued them and opened fire at 0.6 kilometers to kill the rear gunner. We now descend onto an enemy Beaufort, here only achieving a very light smattering of hits and nothing major. And we can see in our dive at roughly 500 km an hour, our turn circle is incredibly wide and our elevators are highly unresponsive, simply because this plane is not made to take speeds above 500 km an hour, or usually take those kinds of speeds. But we will come onto that in due course. We're also using a 30-minute fuel load as standard to make it to the end of the game. And that is our setup for this aircraft. Please be aware that you do not have access to rockets with the Type 5 by comparison with the Type 18, as rockets were not introduced to the I-16 until the later variants. And in our persistence to take down the Beaufort Mark 8, we managed to kill their pilot at close range for our second kill. At which point I noticed another enemy Blenheim in the distance meandering over towards our friendly bases. Having already warded off 2 of the 3 enemy bombers, I'm doing quite a good job in my opinion for a plane which is not suited for attacking bomber style aircraft or those with greater armour plating and durability. Nonetheless, we press on, and we are going to see that I decide to transition after attacking this Blenheim into more of a dogfighter role and interceptor role against enemy fighters rather than bombers, and this is where I make the transition after getting fed up of having to take down targets which are well beyond my capacity. Now this is no reflection upon the rest of my team, but this is one of the key frustrations I have found with the Type 5. This is an aircraft which has the capability to intercept bombers and fighters up high. Yet, when you get into a position to do so, sometimes the armament is just going to let you down non-stop. Yet, let us digress a little further away from this rant already. We now see a chain of enemy fighters attacking what is one of our friendlies. I am unsure of who is chasing whom, and I see that a friendly SU-2 is being chased by an MC-202 and one of our friendly P-36s, although there's a Messerschmitt 110 breaking around for another pass. We come down the back of the P-36G Hawk, opening fire at roughly 0.3 kilometers and achieving a good score of hits to set them on fire. We then break onto the back of the MC-202 Folgeri and achieve a couple of hits, but nothing major. Here we're going to put the overall maneuverability of the I-16 to the test, and I lose track of the MC-202 very briefly, simply because I'm trying to find them in the midst of my blackout, and I'm worried about the enemy Messerschmitt 110 which was making its way over. The 110 is flying off one way, the MC-202 the other way, and we can see here that the poor top speed of the I-16 Type 5 is not allowing me to catch up to the MC-202. And this is another major weakness in this aircraft, its low top speed, and therefore what could be contributed to as an underpowered engine nature, regardless of the refinements to the engine historically, means that you may not be able to catch a good portion of your monoplane opponents. The MC-202 comes around for a head-on, and I use my very high roll rate and decent rudder response in order to snap roll out of the way, although I do the majority of it just based on the roll rate and the elevator in the end. The MC-202 pilot is very smart and decides to continue to run, simply because I just cannot catch up to my opponent, despite being the more manoeuvrable foe. And as I reflect upon the score screen, I see that there are no imminent threats, and so I can just gradually take my time and make my way back over to the main battlefield. So really, this review so far has been a bit of a rant, and despite achieving our third kill on that enemy P-36G Hawk, we've seen that the armament of this plane is lacking, and its overall top speed is quite poor. We also have to highlight that this plane's performance in terms of altitude is restrained to lower altitudes. Above 4,000 meters you will find the performance of this plane, especially in terms of the engine, drops off drastically, and we experienced that when chasing the enemy Blenheim. I try to go for the MC-200 here, and they soon turn around, which enables me to make my pass. I achieve a good portion of hits, including the critical on their fuel tank, and I see an enemy P-36A Hawk here trying to break up on one of my friendlies. I achieve a good number of hits, but due to the highly armoured nature by comparison with my own plane of the P-36A Hawk, I cannot achieve a critical, and as they use their high top speed and acceleration and dive to break away, I continue my relentless assault on the MC-200 in order to put them down for another kill. With 4 kills in the bag, I break away and I reconsolidate my position. Feeling quite chuffed in the fact that thus far we've had very little to do other than gradually saunter our way through the battlefield and pick off opponents of opportunity, by comparison with the furball frenzies that you can face in this plane when going up against biplane opponents. I see an enemy Blenheim here dropping bombs on one of our friendly bases, or diving in order to avoid friendly fire, and we soon catch up to the Blenheim. I open fire, but as we can see once again, despite putting in multiple hits and killing one of the gunners, we just have not got the firepower to put them down. And despite looping over once again to put in a couple more rounds, we only achieve another hit, nothing major, and we take some return fire, with our friendly F2A Buffalo soon ramming our opponent. We should also note that the durability of the I-16 Type 5 is nothing to brag about. The fact that you are flying what is, in my opinion, a massive engine, even by the looks of it, means that a couple of hits to the engine, or indeed in a head-on pass, can lead to the engine being taken out quite swiftly. Additionally, whilst this plane can take a good portion of rifle caliber fire in its tail section or main fuselage, hits to the wings will usually cause you to lose your wings in a very short space of time, especially from 12.7mm Browning ammunition, as I found when I tried to go into a head-on with this P-36A Hawk, which is why I swiftly broke upwards. The Hawk here levels out having broken around, and I continue my relentless assault, setting them on fire in the main fuselage, and as I break up and around, I score my ace in a day. At this point I level out, and I actually go into a little bit of a celebratory nature here, simply because that is only the third ace in a day I've had with this aircraft. The majority of my games have been 3 for 0 or 4 for 0, never an ace or more. And as we continue on our way, we gradually try to pick out another target, and I see this enemy Hurricane in the distance. As we converge on the enemy Hurricane, let us go back to the altitude performance of this plane. As I stated, above 4,000 meters altitude, the I-16 Type 5 is not ideal, and as we use our maneuverability to brake off to the side and force our Hurricane Mark 1 opponent to try and brake up and follow us, we can see that our superior roll rate and very powerful rudder, much like the Hurricane, means that we can actually force our Hurricane opponent to chase after us and eventually bleed out all of their energy. They are on the verge of a stall here, and so I stall myself out and use my roll rate to bring myself around. Yet the Hurricane is one of the more durable fighters that you can face, as after my first pass, which rings in no major hits, I have to rinse and repeat in quite traditional fashion, although I think here the mental state of the Hurricane pilot was one of giving up, simply because they could have reacted by now if they'd wanted to. I then have to use a third pass just on the cusp of a stall in order to try and put more shots into the Hurricane. And finally I achieve a critical, although you can see how much ammunition we have had to throw into our target. And there goes our 6th kill, as we finally separate one of the wings from the fuselage of the Hurricane. And in levelling out, we can see that the battlefield is pretty clear of enemy planes, despite that CR-42 in the distance. Ergo, when you are not trying to combat against the overall power of this plane above 4,000 meters altitude, this plane works very well in an altitude range of roughly 1,000 to 2,000 meters. Going above 2,000 into the 2,500 to 3,500 meter range is suitable for this aircraft, although be aware that most of your opponents will not venture above these altitudes or into this altitude range in particular. On the same respect, going below 1,000 meters altitude, means that you will not always have the space in order to use manoeuvres such as split S's in order to break away from your more manoeuvrable foes in biplanes, and I advise flying a little bit above this altitude in order to compensate for this nature. Especially if you get a KI-10 or an I-153 on your tail, one of the main things you can do is split S and try to run for it, because despite these planes having similar roll rates to yourself and much higher manoeuvrability, they will not always have the acceleration in order to match up to your plane's power plant, nor the top speed, despite your top speed being a little bit underwhelming as discussed earlier. In terms of speed range, we saw with this aircraft that when we went into a very sharp turn based on the elevator and ailerons at 500 km/h plus, we could not bring the plane round very quickly. The elevators become very unresponsive at about 450 km/h, and so I would advise sticking to a speed range of 250 to 350 km/h for your overall engagement zones. Nonetheless, let us take a look at some post-game stats. Therefore, we can see that our 6 kills allowed us to achieve 9,001 silver lines. On top of this, we earned 1,279 research points, with 384 going towards our research on the LA-7B20. We hereby conclude our review of the I-16 Type 5 by realising that once you look past the weaknesses, which include but are not limited to the poor durability, rather poor top speed by comparison with other monoplane counterparts at a battle rating of 1.7 through to 2.0, and the lack of high altitude performance in this aircraft above 4,000 meters, you are looking at one of the more manoeuvrable monoplanes for the battle rating, simply because when you combine the powerful rudder, very high roll rate, probably the best in its class, and overall flexibility and manoeuvrability of the light flame, you will see that this plane can outmaneuver any of the monoplanes it may face. And when you think about that armament of two 7.62mm machine guns mounted in the wings, whilst it is rather apathetic by comparison with the bomber armament and armour, you are able to put down any fighter you can envision very swiftly through successive passes. You may need 2 or 3 in order to put down the Hurricane Mark 1, but in the end you have got the manoeuvrability to stay on the tail of your opponent, something which they may lack. Although I would really avoid going head on with most opponents, simply because trading blows in a head on will usually lead to you losing your engine, a rather exposed and valuable component to this plane. Additionally, the poor durability means that it only takes a couple of 12.7mm machine gun rounds in order to rip a wing out of its spar, and so it is not always ideal to put yourself in a risky situation. We can see that by comparison to the rest of our team, we came second, simply because we stuck to more of a boom and zoom style of play, but one of harassment rather than calculated response. We continually harass the enemy bombers at the start thanks to our great climb rate in order to force them down into the ground or into the hands of more capable opponents such as our friendly Spitfire Mark 1. We then turned our attentions on isolated enemy fighters, breaking into turn fights where appropriate. And this is the key of the day. You cannot stay in a furball for too long because of the likelihood of receiving 1 or 2 rounds from friendly or enemy aircraft. Instead, you have to try and pick on the stragglers or those who find themselves isolated from the battlefield. In doing so, you can quickly apply the maneuverability of your light frame to great effect and break your opponents down bit by bit. As a result, if you are looking for a fighter which is able to harass the living hell out of most of its opponents and, if needs be, outrun them in the form of biplane opponents, then the I-16 Type 5 Ishak is the fighter for you. And so I've been TX141, and if you've enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future War Thunder videos on my channel. Just to note, ladies and gentlemen, I am aware that I've hit the 700 subscriber milestone and I am very grateful for it. I will be releasing a channel update for December 2014 in the near future. Yet until next time, ladies and gentlemen, take care and good luck in the skies.